Terry Cooke. You're watching a truncated Reader's Digest condensed version of Hamilton's vital signs. We've got 15 minutes. We normally have 30, and unfortunately we're going to try and cover a fairly complex subject and one with some great history. The reason we're here today is because it's Open Doors Hamilton, and it's also a Bike for Mike Day, so the sun is shining for the first time I think since Christmas.
Yes, long time.
I'm really pleased to have with us two gentlemen from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, Hugh Tye, the Executive Director, and Lyndon George, who runs our Indigenous programs. And we're going to talk specifically about Canada's 150, because for many Canadians, this is a point of celebration and recollection. For many others, particularly our Indigenous community, this comes with some real mixed emotions and I think some checkered history. You are at the Community Legal Clinic, easy for me to say,
yes,
involved in a remarkable program around reconciliation, specifically geared to allies.
Yes.
And it is called Yon Dene. Tell us about that.
Well, the initiative at the legal clinic is called Yon Dene, but this is a particular campaign that we've designed called I Am Committed. Right, yes, which was the brilliant idea of my colleague Lyndon, inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which came out in late 2015. Which provided a series of recommendations for reconciliation for this country called calls to action. So the first phase of the campaign was called I Am Affected, and that was for Indigenous people to discuss, often for the first time publicly, about intergenerational trauma, which is one of the legacies of the Indian residential school system, which is what the TRC was all about. And the second phase, called I Am Committed, and it's a poster campaign, and I'll show you an example in just a minute, is for friends and allies of Indigenous people to make a public statement that they are committed to the calls to action. So I'll just hold this up for the camera, but it features some fairly iconic photos from the Indian residential school system, and the public statement, I am committed to the calls to action. So you happen to see my photo there, but it's friends and allies to publicly make a commitment to the reconciliation process. And in the campaign, there will be some well-known personalities. For example, Fred, the Mayor Fred is there, two councillors, Green and Johnson, as well as everyday people like you and I, Terry, who want to make a public statement that we want to go forward with reconciliation. We are hoping that you'll see it in bus shelters across the city. The first campaign was across the city as well. And there will be a website, I Am Committed, which you can go to, put your name on, add your picture, share it in social media, try to spread the word to make the campaign go, quite frankly, national.
Great
so
stuff.
It's local, it's also provincial, but it's also national.
I was in Selkirk, Manitoba recently, and in the drive around I saw where Marie Sinclair had grown up, and heard the story of his people and his remarkable emergence as a leader in this country.
Yeah.
So Lyndon, this is your program. You're also the son of a residential school survivor. Tell us a little bit about how you conceived of this and why working with allies matters.
Working with allies matters for me because in order for us to receive any kind of reconciliation and work towards reconciliation, this is something that we all need to do. And as Senator Murray Sinclair has so gracefully stated, that this is just not an Indigenous problem, an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian problem. So recognizing that Indigenous people, ancient societies, have been here for thousands of years, while many Canadians will be celebrating Canada 150 years, we'll be reflecting on the war that Canada had launched on Indigenous people through different policies, different procedures, different laws that would prohibit us and some of the things that we could and could not do in our ways of life. And some of those policies, some of those procedures, some of those laws include things like the Indian Act, include things like the Canadian Indian Residential School. And the trauma, the historical and the intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people that still exists today.
Very good. Tell me about the work that you're doing, because this obviously is an attempt to build understanding and commitment. How do you go about that?
Well, it's very much about relationships. I think what reconciliation in this country is going to be about is changing how we think and talk about each other, changing those relationships. So it's a collaborative journey. When the report was released, Justice Sinclair, who's now Senator Sinclair, said, "We have described for you the mountain. We have shown you a path to the top. We call upon you to do the climbing." So the climbing, we believe, starts...
Language very reminiscent of MLK.
Yeah.
Right? We think about that.
Yeah.
I've seen the mountaintop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the 94 calls to action, and I think we need to start by looking at those and making them meaningful for us as individuals, because I think we can be overwhelmed as individuals by this daunting journey that we need to take. And so we need to make it personal. We need to bring it into our lives and recognize that it's part of our shared history. It's a very dark chapter in our collective history, but it belongs to everyone, newcomers, as well as those who have been here for generations. And so this is really an education campaign. It's an opportunity to be engaged and to motivate all of us to move towards action.
Lyndon, I'm curious about your journey and how you engage one-on-one in the conversations here grounded in our community around reconciliation, and how it is that you help non-Indigenous people understand their own history and I think reconnect with our shared history.
One of the important concepts as to why these two very important programs were designed was, number one, to educate on the history of the Canadian Indian residential school system, knowing that there are thousands of Canadians who still do not know and are unaware that these residential schools existed, and what more importantly, what happened behind the walls of Canadian Indian residential schools, and how that legacy of abuse, the legacy of murder, the legacy of genocide that was introduced through all of these policies and procedures and laws, the effects that it has on Indigenous people. So for me, one of the primary objectives of the I Am Affected campaign that was prior to the I Am Committed was to afford Indigenous people, my brothers and sisters, the opportunity to regain their voice again and start talking about our collective history here in Canada, start identifying and looking at within ourselves how this historical and intergenerational trauma manifests itself through us, and how we're trying to navigate this country and all of these new procedures and laws and policies so that we can begin the healing that we need to do so that the future looks brighter for all of us in Canada.
I find it remarkable as a Canadian and as somebody who has an undergraduate degree in Canadian history. I'm the son of a history teacher, and I would confess firsthand that I have historically known way more about the civil rights movement and the history of slavery south of the border in the United States, partially because we lived there for a period when I was growing up, than I do about our history as Canadians with our Indigenous peoples. It's an area that was largely conspicuously omitted from most of our educational journeys, and that's part of what that strikes me we're trying to correct here is really to retell the story with a fuller appreciation of all of the peoples who were part of this land.
Absolutely. I think education is probably the biggest recommendation coming out of the TRC. It needs to be in the school system. It needs to be in our institutions, in our governments. I think if anyone is interacting with Indigenous peoples, there needs to be an understanding of that shared history. And you can't change a relationship if you don't think very carefully about people and their lived experience. And so seeing the world through their lived experience is the start.
And it strikes me that a huge part of this is building trust in terms of kind of an honest dialogue.
Yes, Yondené, which is the initiative at the clinic, that's its sole purpose, is to build relationships of trust with the Indigenous community. And Lyndon is helping us do that by being in community, by working with community. This initiative is in partnership with PANG, which is the Professional Aboriginal Advocacy and Networking Group. So all of this has to be collaborative. It has to be working together, walking the path. Yondené is a Mohawk phrase for you and I will go there together. So very much recognizing that this is a collective effort.
Lyndon, tell me about how non-Indigenous Canadians can engage in this conversation. Where do we start, and what's the point of intersection? And just talk to us a little bit about the work that you're actually doing.
Well, I think with our fellow Canadians, one of the simplest things that Canadians can do is educate ourselves. We have the means, we have the technology, we can hit the Google button at any time, hit Indigenous people in Canada and start learning, start educating ourselves on the true history, and start having these conversations and looking at how these historical events, how historical trauma and intergenerational trauma affects Indigenous people. And we know now that we can connect a lot of these situations, these critical situations for Indigenous people in Canada, to this dark history and to these dark chapters. So we can look at crisis situations like murdered and missing Indigenous girls, women, and trans in Canada, and we can connect it back to history. We can look at suicide. We can look at the water crisis. There's crisis situations for Indigenous people in Canada right across the board in our country. So I think educating ourselves and investigating the true history and the relationship that Canada has with its Indigenous people is key. And then think about what there is that we might be able to do in our personal lives to change attitudes towards Indigenous people. Start getting rid of the stereotypical visions that we have of Indigenous people, such as Indigenous people are drunks, and those types of things. They need to leave our everyday consciousness, and be mindful that even though the last doors for the Canadian Indian residential schools closed in 1996, there are hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who are affected still by the things that happened in Canadian residential schools, who are living in our communities, who are trying to work through this trauma and support us and help us by just simply understanding and knowing this collective history that we have in Canada. I think that's the first movement forward. And I think the next thing is, as Hugh has mentioned, is at least read the calls to action, because that will provide some insight into this history.
Very good. And the last minute, Hugh, goes to you. Tell us what you're most proud of in this work.
I think the relationships that we've been able to develop with the Indigenous community. We're very proud to be sponsoring campaigns like I Am Committed, and it demonstrates the commitment as an organization that we have shown to reconciliation and walking that path together. So we're very proud of that. We hope that this campaign will actually really take off right across the country. We want people to get excited about it, but take it very seriously. It's not a light-hearted campaign.
Fantastic. Yeah. The program is I Am Committed.
Yes.
The work you're doing is described as Yondené. Lyndon George and Hugh Tye from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic. My commitment to you is 15 minutes doesn't do this important and complex topic justice. We'd love to have you come back this fall, and we will do the non-Reader's Digest condensed version of the wonderful work you're doing in Hamilton. I thank you for that work. I commit to you that we will do what we can as citizens and as Community Foundation to carry it forward, and I look forward to continuing our conversation sometime later this year.
That'd be great, Terry.
Thanks
very much.
Thanks for being with us. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. I'm Terry Cooke from Hamilton Community Foundation. You've been watching a Reader's Digest condensed version on Open Doors Hamilton of Vital Signs. We hope that you'll follow us on Facebook and Twitter and join us again next month. Take care. We are over and out.